Awesome, we're live. Hey guys, it's been a very long time. It's been 8 months since I've done a discussion like this, so let's get straight back into it. Okay, so I have with me Azul Mazad. So Azul, if you would be more than happy to, I'd love to for you to introduce yourself. That'd be fantastic.
Okay, normally I need no introduction. I'm well known within the really small demi-monde of digital vegan activism. That's where most people watching this video will know me from, but that's only the latest hat I've been wearing. I have a background in philosophy. I noticed, Derek, you normally do describe yourself as a philosopher rather than political philosopher, or rather than someone involved in politics. I guess I can say intellectually, I started off in the Western tradition, ancient Greek and Roman, as well as German 19th century and all that stuff. You probably know this from my YouTube channel. I grew up in an extreme left-wing household, so I also got a background in economics as part of my progress kind of emerging from communist and socialist ideology. I started to understand capitalism and understand how deeply flawed a lot of those sources were, but I also read stuff like Karl Marx for myself, along with Lenin, Stalin, what have you. At the end of that process, though, I was generally quite dissatisfied with Western European thinking and philosophy. And then I moved on to Buddhist philosophy. And that was about 10 years of my life doing Buddhist philosophy. And again, if you guys know my channel, you'll know I didn't turn off my brain and suddenly become uncritical or apolitical. I was interested in slavery and poverty and real history and real problems. I was a very mud and blood, Buddhist philosopher. And still cared about politics, still cared about economics. At the end of that period of my life, that was when I started to get more serious about veganism, which is kind of interesting in itself. And, in each of those periods, I was looking for how I could make a positive difference in the world. And I'd become strictly vegetarian back in the year 2000. The year 2000 doesn't sound like all that long ago, but you really never heard the word vegan back then. It existed, but the prominence of the word vegan hadn't come up yet. So just really briefly, at that time, I already thought that wearing leather was immoral, but I didn't describe myself as vegan. And my diet was probably 90% vegan, but I identified as strictly vegetarian. And then when I made the transition to being vegan, that was not really a significant change in my life, but it made my actions consistent with my morals, that extra step. But I didn't think of vegan activism as that significant politically or philosophically until relatively late. And I was involved in ecology and real world politics in different ways before that too. Again, people who know my channel know I did get directly involved in ecology and lobbying for change at City Hall, at government level, and that sort of thing. Anyway, out of the ashes of my engagement with Buddhism, I tried various other things, including that I tried to get involved with humanitarian work, political activism, and active research with Korean and Ojibwe, which is one of the reasons why my list of languages I've studied is so long. So I studied quite a list of Asian languages, and then I started working on languages indigenous to North America. So throughout this, you can say I've been simultaneously engaged with research and humanitarian work. Those have been kind of the guiding principles of my life, and all of it at the same time being frankly quite philosophical, for better and for worse.
Yeah.
And now, as I say, veganism is kind of my main identity, in part because so many of those other things I worked on ended in failure. So it's really easy for me to imagine a parallel universe where the main thing I was working on was indigenous languages and politics, and I just happened to be vegan. Or where the main thing I was working on was politics and human rights in Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand, or even Buddhist manuscript and historical research, and I'm vegan, where that's one of the things. But as those other things, features in the landscape collapsed, veganism has become the main thing I'm known for giving morality lectures on. A lifetime rich in morality lectures.
Okay, so let's actually talk about the foundations, pretty much all of your ideology. So,
okay, let me just some people are going to see this who don't know you. So I've said a lot about myself. Could I just ask you, one of the things I mentioned about you is that you describe yourself mostly in terms of philosophy, but you say a lot of things you want to talk about in this video are politics. So can you just talk a little bit about your own engagement with philosophy and what why you wear that hat or what it means to you?
Okay, so basically, I got introduced to philosophy through. Is that my end or your end?
I don't hear anything wrong. It sounds fine to me.
Oh, sorry, there was an echo just for a second. Okay, so basically, I got introduced to philosophy through a guy named Darth Dawkins quite a while ago, perhaps 2016. Although before that, my handle on YouTube was called DZ Philosophy. I had a few inklings as to what philosophy was, through the ancient Greeks, but I never read any of the stuff. So I literally had no idea what I was talking about. In other words, I was a sophist. But I had to learn the hard way, and I think that's what got me most interested into the subject. So because I would classify myself as an atheist, I'd be very staunch about my beliefs, and I would actually try to express them online. And because I listened to a lot of Christopher Hitchens back in the day, I thought I was some genius debater. So I got myself involved in a lot of dissent, a lot of arguments with random people who would be open to discussing it. And my attempts at deflating their arguments would prove to be very inefficacious, if you will. So over time, I got involved in more debates with more people, and I realized that, wow, I'm not some genius debater. I'm just some kid who has no idea what he's talking about. So, and I learned that lesson through talking to a few people. I learned that lesson through talking to a guy named Darth Dawkins back in 2016, and my clash with the Drunken Peasants fan base.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, they lambasted the hell out of me back in 2016, but that's because I acted like a complete moron and made unsubstantiated arguments to them. I learned my lesson swiftly and soundly, to say the least. So that was my first introduction to philosophy. But what got me interested in philosophy itself was my introduction to a guy named Jack Untitled. Now, he is the owner of a Discord server called Debate Coliseum, although he has pretty large connections to a lot of people in the great debate community. Jack Untitled, another guy named Steve McRae, Ozymandias Ramses II, a few people in the skeptic community that are probably more base level, who like to discuss things with people who are like flat earthers or presuppositionalists. And that segues us onto the subject of Darth Dawkins, because I had a debate with him, and I remember he completely flabbergasted me. So he told me to look into one thing. He said the 3 laws of logic. I'm like, I didn't know there's laws of logic. I thought it was just intuitional. So I looked into them, and that was my first introduction. And then I started to actually understand the types of conversations these other people, like Ozymandias Ramses II, what they were talking about. Because before, it would just go well over my head. I thought I'd get the gist, but then I'd get really bored. So I was like, I don't actually understand this stuff. So I started looking into it. And then I've got my first wave of books that I bought. Yes!
Great.
Philosophical methodology, theory of knowledge, meta-epistemology and skepticism. So that's, I'd say, probably 3 favorite books in this pile, but I've got stacks of others on the philosophy of language, philosophy of logic even, which is actually pretty rare, the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of science, and then onto phenomenology, philosophy of mind, onto ethics, philosophy of art, political philosophy, philosophy of social science, philosophy of psychology, and critical theory and decision theory. So all these very, very interesting subjects. And I've pretty much skimmed through all these books, but I make sure that they're really like sequentially ordered. So that way, when I read one book, the next book I read will be well grounded on the previous book. So what I'm reading right now is a thing called Introduction to Metaphilosophy. So I'm just rereading it because I've read it like 3 times so far. So I was trying to get a better understanding of it so I can also like make a video on it. So through reading all this stuff, I got a much better idea of the general scope of philosophy. And with that, I've happened to be able to understand a lot more important stuff over time coming from the mouths of other individuals. And I think that's actually really important. You shouldn't start off by listening to personalities. You need to start off with the fundamental stuff, and then with a critical scope, listen to the personalities. So that was my introduction to philosophy. As
you can put a more positive gloss on the same story, which is that you're motivated to learn the fundamentals because you've been through this process of But I just mentioned, so one of the differences between you in terms of my approach to philosophy. I mean, you mentioned boredom, and boredom is a real factor. I mean, like I'm not going to. Some people just go, oh, well, how can you? This is such a great book, and you feel bored. But partly to avoid boredom, and partly because of what I felt was real and what was fake. My approach was really based on primary sources, because I found the secondary sources very insincere. So, if I wanted to know Aristotle, I'd go and read Aristotle directly. And I think a lot of people will give you warnings about that, like, well, so when I was 19 or younger, even reading this stuff, I brought different kinds of distorting biases and expectations to reading it. And I'm cursed with a very good memory. This is a blessing and a curse. But I'm now reading this book, and I think the last time I read it, I was 19 years old. And I can remember how differently I responded to the same passages of text as a 19-year-old, and I'm now 39. It's weird. It's a really, really strange experience. But yeah, I have a series of videos that's still ongoing that are on my channel, and they're also on my girlfriend Melissa's channel, where we are really reading a lot of the foundations of European philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Xenophon. It's not that long a list. And it's a list I put together for my girlfriend. And I just say, so those videos will not, you may enjoy watching those videos, and they may or may not interest you enough to read some of those ancient sources in the primary source. But it was an interesting challenge for me, because when I met my girlfriend, she basically, expressed her jealousy. She was like, look, you have this background, you have this education that you gave yourself. She was aware it really isn't something I learned in the classroom. And she said, what is it she should learn from it? And the interesting thing is, because she's with me at this stage in my life, I really said to her, look, the most important stuff is ancient Athens. It's really knowing what happened in ancient Athens in this pretty short period of history in ancient Athens too. It's kind of 1 century. This especially important century in Athens. And when I was younger, again, I mentioned a sense of disappointment with Western philosophy. I wouldn't underestimate that. I mean, you come out of an atheist background, and I don't just mean that you're atheist, but that you're engaged with ideas and debates in atheism. One of the most disappointing things about European philosophy is the extent to which almost all of it is directly or indirectly about God, about the existence of God. So to give an example, what Immanuel Kant says about epistemology, all of it is indirectly about faith in God, or and it's really funny because anyway, I've recently talked to a couple of people. I just mentioned it in passing in a video, and I got email from people saying, no, you misunderstood Kant's philosophy. And I was like, no, don't even think about it. But the extent to which someone like he really is setting the groundwork for an argument for the existence of God. So now, of course, there are a few atheist philosophers, but when I was a young man, so give 2 examples. I was pissed off with Aristotle at 19 because he doesn't deal with slavery, or he doesn't deal with slavery the way I want him to deal with slavery. And it's like, how can I take seriously a philosopher who's talking about democracy and equality, doesn't deal with slavery? But likewise, a lot of the classics of European philosophy, just so much of it was about the Christian monotheistic project that I got pissed off at. So I just say, if my girlfriend had met me when I was her age, she's now 25, I probably would have had a totally different approach. And I wouldn't have seen the ancient Greek works as being as valuable. I would have been more in my kind of anti-Eurocentric period of, I don't know, something from ancient Buddhism would be on the reading list or something. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but as it is now, now that I've grown a long beard, now that I'm a middle-aged man, I do see the unique significance of those sources from Athens in a very different light. Yeah. But hey, that's perspective based on knowledge, not on ignorance. So I can say that.
So over time in your history, has it fluctuated between thinking that perhaps the Greeks were the most important philosophers with their ideas, and or perhaps was there a time where you ever thought that the Germans perhaps had the best ideas?
Well, the one, okay, there are really only a couple of Germans that I really relate to positively, and they're very dissident voices. So we're really talking about Arthur Schopenhauer and Max Stirner and a few other kind of radical, unpredictable figures who were not accepted in the mainstream. I mean, I regard Friedrich Nietzsche as garbage. I basically regard him as being like a newspaper columnist, not a real philosopher. He says a lot of stuff just to get attention. So I just don't think he should be taken seriously as a philosopher. And somebody like Hegel, GWF Hegel, whose significance has been massively exaggerated for many reasons, including his alleged influence on Karl Marx and thus Marxism and thus communism. To me, again, this is really garbage. So no, and again, some of these other issues are there. The preoccupation with Christianity and monotheism, the themes that are being dealt with. And sorry, just one other thing to say. What is philosophy? My perspective is actually that philosophy is a problem-solving method, or plural. It's a bunch of problem-solving methods, and then discussions we have about problem-solving methods. And so this is interesting. If someone says to you that they consider Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung a great philosopher. In a sense, Sigmund Freud is a philosopher. But I think it's worth asking the question, well, what are the problems that he solved? Or what are the problem-solving methods he introduced to philosophy? And, I don't think Sigmund Freud, found a cure for anorexia. I'm sorry, this is maybe a gross example, but I think, if the point was that this type of neurosis, that would be Freud's term, can be solved through philosophical conversations, which is his belief. His belief was in the talking cure in some way, like a Socratic, notion. You sit down and have these peculiar conversations and solve your neuroses, your mental problems, your mental and sexual problems. I think it's worth saying, well, he didn't solve the problems. He actually failed. Now, again, sorry, this isn't saying the work of Sigmund Freud is of absolutely zero value. I think actually it's an interesting philosophical question. Can any book over 200 pages be of absolutely zero value? But yeah. This question, in this sense, I have something in common with Karl Popper, who's a philosopher of science.
Yes.
Which is I do think fundamentally philosophy is not like poetry or literature. The value of poetry is not going to be problem solving. But yeah, when I say so dismissively, well, I don't think Nietzsche is worth anything. I don't think Hegel is worth anything. One, my bias is I'm looking at philosophy as a problem solving method. And then two, there's the selection of which problems you're trying to solve. So again, just because I have it on the table as the example, Aristotle tries to solve some problems with democracy, but slavery is not one of them. He just doesn't problem. So it's, all right, that's interesting. So, and so on. Many philosophers in that sense are deeply flawed. But just to mention, someone like Schopenhauer, at least he's an atheist. And at his time, he felt censored. He couldn't express himself terribly directly as an atheist. Yeah. And he's really a dissident voice in that era. So for me, Schopenhauer was part of my appreciation for Buddhist philosophy, where I started seeing European philosophy as just one voice. As I say, kind of the falling apart of the Eurocentric myth that progress and new ideas was something that happened everywhere and was not uniquely Western European, which, I guess I'm glad I climbed up that tree, and saw the view from over there to some extent. But sure, having been up the tree, again, the question of which problems you're going to solve, you will not find the basis for democracy in the Buddhist canon or Buddhist philosophy. And that's, again, which problems you're going to solve. That's a problem I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in how do we have a democratic society now and in the future. So, yeah. From that perspective, the legacy of ancient Athens and one special century in ancient Athens it's really tremendously important. Yeah,
absolutely. So, what would you say would be the most important concepts that have come from the Greeks that have contributed to philosophical discussion even to this day?
Wow. Well, so I'm a nihilist, so I'm biased in this sense. When you compare the ancient Greeks to what follows after in the Dark Ages, what's so productive is the culture of doubt and self-doubt and cross-examination. Everyone and everything is being questioned, and Socrates to some extent exemplifies this. But whether you're looking at Socrates or 2 generations later with Aristotle, the question of what is good and what is bad and what is justice and even what is democracy and what is the afterlife. It may seem pedantic that you sit down one Greek after another. They'll start all of these discussions by defining the terms, which of course is good practice anyway. But you think, come on, do you really need to define what is democracy at the start of this passage or what have you? And the answer is yes, you really do, because this was a time in a culture where those things there was not just debate, there was real doubt.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, the essence of Christianity is of trying to get people to live with no sense of doubt. No. This part of the mentality of faith in Christendom is things that raise doubt. Don't even think about them. Shut that out of your mind. Don't let this idea that that's the devil, whispering in your ear or something. No. Unthinkable. You kind of partition your mode of thinking. And the Greeks, by contrast, live in this constant state of doubt and cross-examination, including the court system, including everyone being dragged in and put on trial and possibly flogged or fined or beaten to death, and including, it's not really my bag, but in terms of the progress of science, the fact that there was an open debate, which was based ultimately on arithmetic, observations of the movement of the planets, about whether the sun was geocentric or heliocentric, whether the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the Earth. And this debate was not possible a couple of centuries later in Christian Europe. And by the way, the heliocentric model lost. The arguments in support of the Earth being at the center, they actually won. So the fact that you can have the debate and you can have the evidence presented doesn't mean, Socrates was executed. It doesn't mean, the fact that you have a trial doesn't mean that the innocent people are found innocent and so on. But yeah, that's so to me, I'm kind of answering in terms of an underlying value. But if you want to direct answer your question, obviously, the big ones are democracy, equality, justice, those social and political concepts. Yeah, I have to say those are absolutely the most fundamental. And beyond that, today people use the term cultural relativism in a negative sense. It's true that people like Aristotle, and even more so people like Herodotus, they did examine their own culture and its values and assumptions in contrast to other fundamentally different cultures.
Yeah.
And you give a simple example, a lot of people know it's infamous that Athens was quite tolerant towards what we now consider pedophilia or pederasty.
Yeah.
But they had other cultures right next door where those were serious crimes, and they were aware of that contrast. They had other cultures where the idea of marriage was totally different, where ideas about morality and so much totally different. And so that also brought about a type of lively doubt. Where do our cultural values and assumptions come from? And the answer was not from God. The answer was a more sophisticated examination of law and cultural convention and even legend and myth and what have you. So yeah, for me, that's the essence of the thing. As a nihilist, I think doubt is something we have to learn to value positively, in our own cognition and another level in our societies and so on. Yeah.
Okay, so with regards to, say, for instance, discussion, weeding out what tends to be the minority's opinion, wouldn't that point out or illustrate a issue to be found within democracy's very essence? Say, for instance,
right.
You could even equate democracy to be a type of appeal to popularity, or perhaps might equals right. What's your take on that?
Right. Well, okay. Democracy in the ancient Athenian sense is ruled by the demos, and it's ruled by the poorest. So this is one of my personal bugbears or enthusiasm. So, it's true we have this fear of the majority beating up on the minority, but, and each of the social classes represents their own interest and so on. But having the poor in government, I can't even say in parliament, directly making decisions in government, I think does very fundamentally change things. So, in terms of what is the function of government and what are the conflicts that arise, most of our countries are struggling with a fundamental indifference of the government towards the poor, as opposed to the government being preoccupied with, providing social services to exactly the people who need the social services. The rich really do not require that the trains run on time. It's really the poor for whom the trains matter, crucially. So, it's nice if the trains are good enough that the rich can enjoy them. That's another thing. But this is a fundamental shift in terms of what is government and what is democracy. Now, I think what needs to be pointed out here is that Athens did not deal with anything like the situation of Canada, committing genocide and having an indigenous ethnic minority who are in that sense, really oppressed and second-class citizens.
Yeah.
And it's a question, could they have? Athens was, of course, it was just one city, but also they never extended any democratic rights to any foreigners. In fact, even if you had one parent who was foreign, if just your mother or just your father was foreign, you'd never participate democratically and so on. So, I think there's a difference to be observed here between one point on the map and, a dominion. That's what Canada is referred to as, the dominion of Canada. And when it's a dominion that was extended over, a foreign enemy people who didn't ask to be conquered, and who then become, an oppressed minority within it. But if we're comparing something to the alternative, So, I do not regard parliament as democratic. I regard what we have in Canada as kind of a system of oligarchy. And this is one of the questions. But if you had democracy, direct democracy in the Athenian sense, then in theory the native people would have been in that demos. They would have been, well, in Athens it was called the boule, wasn't called the parliament. They would have been in government from the earliest period, including the period when they were the majority. So it's impossible to imagine how the evolution of that culture would have been different if you had democracy. But obviously, I think the result would have been a hybrid culture. Like, I don't really think there's a parallel universe in which our native people remained completely untouched by, the technology, culture, and customs of Europe. But if they really were just physically in the halls of power, speaking their own language and involved and so on, it's unimaginable. And so, sorry, I know I'm aware the other person I'm talking to is in Australia, but the situation we're in now is that we have a parliamentary tradition. Sorry, correct me wrong. I think this is true of Australia too. You guys don't even have seats in parliament reserved for Indigenous people or anything like that, do you? It's not the case.
I'm not too sure about that, but they may be pushing towards that. I hear it's very progressive around those areas, especially but to me it sounds more like it's just virtue signaling in order to quell the animosity that a lot of people have, a lot of progressives have with a lot of the politicians. But for the most part, it sounds like they retained their level of the degree of, I guess, tribalistic conservatism. However, they are still at least making that movement towards that type of progressive kind of ideology. Yeah.
Well, anyway, if the question is basically how would democracy deal with oppressing the minority? I mean, the death of Socrates himself is in some ways a warning about this, and I think that's why a lot of people in Athens lost faith in democracy. Democracies are capable of being tyrannical. They're capable of. I mean, Socrates was executed for heresy. They're capable of engaging in witch trials and witch hunts and all those terrible things. But sorry, I mean, it's kind of one thing leading on to another. I mean, I think the conclusion of that, when you see the danger of democracy, the danger towards minorities, the danger of starting wars, the danger of just making bad decisions, is that as soon as you have any real democracy, suddenly you have this tremendous incentive to care about public education. Wow, I can be put on trial just like Aristotle, or these people, the mob that surround me, they can make a decision to go to war or dump sewage in the ocean. They can make bad decisions at any time that are going to be terrible for me. So I have to, and we have to work as hard as possible to raise the quality of education and level of discourse, so that we don't go back to, witch trials in the Dark Ages or what have you. And the elitism built into other forms of government really, I think, leads to indifference towards public education. And even atheism is an example of this, where I think elites have the attitude of, oh well, those people can still believe in traditional Christianity, as if those people don't matter. Anyway. I mean, to me that's a sickeningly elitist attitude. But the belief that Christianity should continue as the opiate for the masses. This shows that the masses do not have a share of governing or government power. I think I think it is tremendously meaningful to reach out to and really try to change life for quote unquote those people where it's and you do see this. I mean, the bizarre outbursts from the far right wing lately, who are by no means the only Christians, shows the extent to which those sectors of society have indeed been neglected and I guess have reverted to some medieval attitudes. What can I tell you?
Yeah, that's definitely tribalism, I would say. But let's actually shift gears a little bit. I want to move more into nihilism, but we'll do that through the vehicle of first discussing what beliefs ought to be held to maximize your effectiveness as a political vector. What kind of approaches, what virtues do you need to be holding in order to most accurately and functionally approach politics, economics, and anything around the social sciences?
Right. But so you phrased the question in terms of belief. So you asked, what do you need to believe to engage in politics?
For the most charitability, because there are some beliefs that will pigeonhole you into dogmatism, definitely, and other forms of fallacious mindsets. So what would you say would be the best sets of beliefs, at least from your experience?
Right. So my opinion is that the best type of belief to cultivate is none at all. Now, some people might find that, unattainable, but I think it's possible to live with gnawing self-doubt on all these things. So, okay. So, to give an example, you get people involved in humanitarian work, and you might think it's useful for them to say, I believe in this cause. I believe that what we're doing is uplifting the poor. So let's say I'll give a particular example. You have a group of people from France, and they've raised money in France. They have government money and maybe some charity money also. And they're going to a village in Laos, and they say, okay, we're going to uplift this village, out of poverty. Now, it might seem self-evident, especially for someone who's grown up with a dogmatic system of belief, that the best thing you can do is have everyone motivated like a sports team saying we're going to win, with the belief that what they're doing is right, is right and good, and it's going to achieve its aims. But actually, procedurally, cognitively, ethically, and even pragmatically, what you want is the exact opposite. Is you want people to be really skeptically and with self-doubt examining each of the decisions you make at every step, and asking exactly those questions. Is it right what we're doing? Is this going to work? Why do we assume this is going to work? So project I'm thinking of, this was published, although the author was anonymous because he was an insider on the project. They said they were going to lift these people out of poverty and improve their agriculture. And one of their big projects was they were going to build a bridge to connect this community to another community. And this specific project, this was in northern Laos, was such a disaster with all this French government money that at the end, the villagers had literally abandoned the village. So the population of the village was reduced to 0. So as a humanitarian project goes, that's about the greatest disaster you can have. The recipients of the donations ran away rather than continuing to receive your charity. And notice this is kind of the slippery slope of faith. It's a great example. And this is totally secular. They weren't a religious charity, by the way.
Sure.
They were government-supported secular charity. So they decided we need to build this bridge. And there's a little road leading up to the bridge, obviously. How are we going to do it? Well, they're going to force the local peasants to build this bridge. Well, they don't want to. And you're paying less than the local minimum wage. They weren't paying nothing, but they were paying almost nothing, much less than the local informal minimum wage, let alone the legal minimum wage in that country. And say, well, we'll get the military to round them up and force them to work. If you believe in the project, I mean, you see how this is, and of course, with religious mentality and everything else. If you believe in the project, you'll do it, right? But what if you're examining it at every stage, and it's like, well, wait a minute, what is it we're really trying to accomplish here? How are we accomplishing? How did we come to this decision, and what are the outcomes? And what are we going to do if A, B, and C? I think it's possible to be, to exactly lack those beliefs that people assume is at the center of politics and effective advocacy, effective intervention, effective humanitarian work. And I think it makes you a much more powerful, devastating person in that field. Because when those issues comes out, I'll give you one more example. So I'm choosing to use real world examples I directly experienced.
Yep.
When I was in Laos, so this is bizarre. This is all taxpayers' money. So that was a French taxpayers' money project that utterly failed. There was another one paid for by the German taxpayers. The German taxpayers were paying to plant more rubber crops in Laos, rubber plantations. That's a very strange form of charity because that sounds like a for-profit business. But again, you have to believe that this is uplifting the poor. This is going to end poverty or have some kind of positive social outcomes. No, I exactly don't believe that. So I did a whole bunch of research on this while I was there, which again just reflects my character. I mean, for me, this is also philosophical in a way. And by complete luck, I was at the airport, tiny airport in Laos, trying to go up to do humanitarian work in the far north. And the director of that project from the German government was there. And I asked him questions of a skeptical kind. I'm just going to use one for brevity. But I said to him, when you look at the history of rubber prices, I know you're committing to this project, as a humanitarian cause. But the price of rubber, it goes up and down all the time. Like I've seen significant, crash in this. Don't you think you're kind of setting up these poor people you're helping to, kind of be undone the next time there's a crash in the rubber price? And I remember he laughed. He really laughed. He laughed in my face. And he said, no, no, no. In China, the demand for rubber is infinite. He believed in the project. Okay, so you don't need to be an expert in economics to know. I'm sorry, the demand for cocaine is not infinite. The price of cocaine goes up and down, and there's a lot more demand for cocaine than there is rubber. And what he was saying was untrue in another technical sense, but you really need to be a nihilist. You need to be living with constant skepticism and self-doubt to pick up on this kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Rubber is one word. And, see, people don't think they have faith in a word. Rubber isn't a word like Jesus or something, but it's still an abstraction. Yeah. What do you mean by rubber? The type of rubber they produce in northern Laos is actually not the same as the type of rubber that's produced in Malaysia. And when the rubber from Laos arrives in China, its value is lower than garbage recycled from the United States of America. Garbage rubber is of a higher grade than the lotion rubber. And they were doing these financial projections on the basis of infinite demand for the Malaysian quality of rubber arriving from Malaysia, not this from.
That's absurd.
And people's lives are being destroyed. I mean, sorry, look, I'm involved in this. A lot of left-wingers will give you shit. Oh, you have a white savior complex and all this stuff. Look, I'm white. I identify as white. Or if you want to consider me Jewish and not white for that reason, fine. But, I've got to tell you, you can't assume that the government of Laos has people who can read English at my level and scrutinize a report and go through the footnotes and figure out what's wrong with it. I have a real role as an intellectual, and indirectly, this has impacts on thousands of people's lives. And the lives it's having impacts on are the poorest of the poor above all else. The rich are going to be okay either way, whether or not the rubber plantation works out, whether or not that building a bridge project works out, and so on. So look, I just say it's a totally good answer. It's a totally good question you presented me with. The question was, in effect, is there something you should believe, as a means to an end in terms of being engaged in politics? But, my answer is the opposite. I think the discipline is living with that, that razor's edge of doubt and self-doubt all the time. Yeah. How do I know what I think I know? And you become sharper in that process. And the only thing I was going to say is all those examples, I had to be able to raise that issue in that moment. I happened to meet this guy at the airport, and it's because I live with this philosophy that I'm able to do that. Yeah. I don't actually think there's an objective sense in which I'm a genius, but living the way I do and reading the way I do. No, I mean, it's not like I have a photographic memory or something, but when I met those people, I'd have all this stuff on hand. And the fact that I don't believe in the project, I don't even believe in what's the definition of rubber. I mean, sorry, it may sound ridiculous. The fact that I'm questioning and doubting this stuff all the time, it leads to that kind of sharpness that you get to use when you happen to be in the meeting with the representative from the European Union, when you happen to be at the airport, and whether it's a formal or informal comment, that you can use that in a democratic setting to make your case or ask the right questions or raise doubts about what's going on. Yeah, that's my sincere answer to that question.
Definitely. So this can actually take us onto the subject of the education system itself. Now, because I'm going to be going into cognitive psychology, this very much interests me because I want to reconstruct the education system. I think, honestly, that we need to start incorporating mandatory philosophical types of classes that perhaps specialize in logics, critical thinking itself. Anything that can actually sharpen the mindset of people, because honestly, if we keep cultivating this type of personality, all it's going to do is lead to the downfall of downtrodden groups and also downfall of our economic robustness. Because if we keep having people in power who run on their own system of faith, that's of course not going to be reaching of the conclusions that they're intending to, because they're going to be ignoring certain variables that may contradict what they're running off, which will lead to the exact opposite conclusion they intend. So what do you think would be the best types of classes we should implement in order to reconstruct how our people think?
Well, okay. So again, my answer is a lot of doubt sewn into it at every level. I've looked at studies of attempts to incorporate critical thinking into the curriculum, and I can't remember. I think they were at the high school level to teach critical thinking. It's possible they were at the college level, and I'm misremembering that article. But they weren't small children, what have you. Yeah. And they set up formal criteria for what is critical thinking. So they had a test, like an IQ test, but it's this kind of test where they would test you for how much critical thinking you had. And they did baseline, midline, edline testing. So to see before you got this education, how good were you at critical thinking, during and after. So you saw the impact of the course. Now, step one there was already tremendously difficult and important. So again, sorry, I already said, how do you define rubber? How do you define democracy? How do you define critical thinking? So obviously there was a huge leap here in actually defining critical thinking as something you can measure. If you can measure it, it exists. And what they found was that the education offered actually lowered the students' ability to do critical thinking. Right? So this is a really interesting puzzle, and it raises the questions of authority in education and what is education and so on. So I've done a lot of reading and talking about philosophy of education within the last year and a half. Well, a lot of it's not on YouTube, probably because of my job in China. So I was giving lectures on philosophy of education in China to Chinese students, which is very interesting. Also, it's this completely non-democratic, dictatorial society. And I was talking about Plato and Aristotle and philosophy of education and the Western, and relatively new ideas like Montessori education. Montessori is new compared to Plato, but it's not that new. But what I pointed out to the students was, so we went over the whole philosophy of education, as history of philosophy of education, ancient to modern, as much as I could put into the course. And when we got to Montessori, I pointed out to them, this is different from every other philosophy of education. This is the one system of education where we can prove as a scientific fact it makes people smarter. I don't know any other. Yes. I don't know any other system of education that could. Yes. And we've done double-blind testing and all that stuff. Yeah. Sorry, I mean, double-blind might not be quite the accurate term, but there was a study in Texas where they took the crucial step of assigning the students at random. So it wasn't the parents' choice whether or not kids went into Montessori. Earlier studies, as you can imagine, that showed that smarter kids were coming out of Montessori. You can say, oh, but maybe it's just because the parents are smarter or something, this kind of thing. No, even when it was a randomized government-controlled trial and people were randomly assigned to these things, so there was no role of wealth or social class, Montessori actually produces smarter people, and it's a measurable difference.
Nice.
And scientifically, when you're going through the data looking for what the difference is, this is my opinion, but it is also based pretty directly. I would say there is one factor that is outstanding and is not debatable. Boredom. Yes. Montessori is less boring, right?
Engagement is absolutely crucial. Absolutely.
Right. Well, in every other system of education, if kids say, well, I mean, look, if I want to teach Aristotle and people say it's boring, this is actually a fundamental problem. So look, I point this out to say, I've made kind of 2 points quickly. One, we can have so-called improvements of education, where people say they're teaching critical thinking, but what are they actually teaching and what are the actual outcomes that may not be improvements? And then two, you can have something like the Montessori system, which was developed for totally different reasons. It was actually developed to help mentally disabled children and children of poor factory workers in Italy who were disadvantaged and socially marginalized. It wasn't created to create a hyper intelligent elite of wealthy people in California, but that's what it's doing. It's only the richest of the rich now who get access to Montessori education, with a few interesting exceptions. There are some schools for the poor that are Montessori education. But I don't think, but I just mentioned, I don't think Montessori claims to teach critical thinking. Yeah, but it evidently does, or at least kids get more out of the education. So this is again the kind of thing you have to be open to. Well, for some reason, this type of education works better. And then I'll throw in a quote from the Dune books. I have not read the Dune books. It's a science fiction series, but there's a quote in there that says, mankind gave over a lot of their thinking to machines, i.e. to computers. They let computers assist them in their thinking. Automation. Because they imagined that by doing so, the machines would set them free, would free them of the burden of their labors. But in fact, this only made them into slaves because the machines themselves were simply controlled by other men at other more powerful machines. This, kind of terrifying, reflection on the role of computer technology. Okay, If you have a problem today that university education or high school education is authoritarian and fails to teach critical thinking, the fundamental problem is if we take this same format and then put the name of critical thinking on top, it's like what the communists did. Communists put new headlines on education. This is going to teach freedom and equality, and all these wonderful ideologies are stamped onto it. How much did education really change in communist China or communist Russia? It remained horrible, authoritarian, and not teaching critical thinking, and so on, and oppressive in various ways. Obviously, I'm not going to ridicule Western education today as being quite the same as that, but whether or not it's possible by invoking the name of critical thinking to actually teach critical thinking, this I'm extremely skeptical about. And conversely, maybe something like the Montessori method, maybe we've actually struck on part of the solution to the problem.
Yeah, so I think engagement might actually eliminate the need to teach critical thinking directly. Perhaps through engagement, the students can learn intuitionally the critical thought and logic behind the subjects that are being taught. So perhaps that would actually unlock massive problems. So what exactly does Montessori teach? Like, do you know their actual subjects?
Yeah, sure, I do. So briefly, Montessori is not based on the. I'll mention one unrelated but parallel thought. Montessori is based on a rejection of the lecture format. So I myself, I lecture on YouTube. And when I was in China, I had the fun. I was a university professor. I got to stand at a podium and theatrically lecture. So I'm, if anything, I'm positively biased about lecturing because I'm good at it. The teacher in Montessori will stand silently, and the students will sit on mats in a circle, but each student is separate. And they sit on a mat, and they have their workbook, and they have a lot of emphasis on tactile learning implements. So the book is going to explain the lesson. Let's say the lesson is about grammar. And then they're probably going to have little pieces of wood with verb, adjective, noun, and the sentence. And they'll read this book, and they'll use the pieces of wood and move them around, and then figure out if they got it right or got it wrong. And if they don't understand what they're doing, they'll put their hand up and ask the teacher to come and explain, okay, I think I've got this figured out, but what am I supposed to do with the adjectives? And that's how it works. So in a sense, I mean, it's closer to a video game than a university lecture, you can imagine, but it's not, there's no video component. But what you're doing in learning alone, but together with the other students, you can imagine in your lunch break, you might talk to the students about what you did, but it's not this back and forth format. Now, I just contrast this with something else, so whether it's university or high school, I think this is true of most primary school also in Western education. You write an essay, you hand it in, you get a grade back, and maybe you get some red circles or whatever. I don't think I ever once had a teacher sit down with me and discuss the essay the way I would as an editor. I've worked as a professional editor of nonfiction.
Nice.
And if you think about critical thinking, and again, this would be a lot of hours. If I'm a teacher and I have 40 students, that may be 40 hours of I mean, maybe even if it's 30 minutes each, and the student has to be willing to, and you have to have a culture. Again, this is a non-authoritarian thing. If I'm standing at the classroom, I can just dictate to you if I'm just lecturing. But to actually sit down with you and say, okay, well, what you're doing here, I understand you got this Wikipedia article and you found this, but what you didn't consider was, and to talk that through with someone that way. Now, look, is that teaching critical thinking? From my perspective, I think yes. I think I like just if you personally wrote an essay, Darren, and you showed it to me, and I went through with you that way. I think there's a sense in which I am teaching critical thinking on whatever the specific issue is. Like, okay, what you don't realize is implicitly, this is saying this, or whatever the issues are about sources or how you use them, and. So this is just one example, and it may be a unique example, but the role of editor is very different from the role of lecturer, and it's very different from the role of grading a paper too. And I think a very small minority of students have that relationship with their parents, where their parents may play that role and talk it through with them, but definitely not a teacher. It's not part of the educational process. And when you think about it, that's more valuable than writing the paper would be, because, sorry, this is a quotation I use all the time. I don't even remember who I'm quoting. Maybe I invented it, but I don't think I did. We do not learn from making mistakes, but from noticing them.
Yeah.
If I can write an essay and it's full of these errors, but if I have someone point them out to me, and then I go and write a revision or I write a better essay or something, that can be a much more meaningful learning process. And that's not what we've got, because it's time consuming. So sorry, this is a specific example, and it's shallow, but it's actually of horrendously crucial importance.
Exactly. I 100% agree. I can't stress that more, because the teachers I've had throughout my high school years, especially throughout my childhood years, they most of the time they would just point out that I had an error here and there, but they would never actually go in depth as to why they're pointing out the error, what exactly the error was conflicting with, like say for instance methodologically, and they would just tell me to follow the strict methods. They wouldn't even tell me the methodology; they would just tell me the methods. And that's the thing. That doesn't teach critical thinking. It doesn't teach you how to understand the nature of what you're doing in learning and in practice. So that's a very big issue in the current education system, or at least the education system I went to. Maybe the audience has individually different experiences with their education system. Perhaps theirs was better, but my experience was horrendous. It was terrible. I flunked out.
We have this in common. But I mentioned, so I got to apply my own philosophy of education in this sense in how I learned Chinese. So Chinese is a very, very hard language to learn. But so if you do the normal method, you will never learn Chinese, because even if I just circle what's wrong and hand it back to you, you will never be able to figure out what you're doing wrong.
Exactly.
There's the gap between languages is broad enough. And I think this is true with more content-based things too. It's like, well, okay, there was something wrong with how I'm using this source, but I'm not actually going to develop this sophisticated perspective on it by just being told I get a C-. But what I would do every day when I took this Chinese course, I would either be writing or rewriting an essay, and then I would sit there with the teacher face to face, and we'd go through it. And it could take a whole hour, where she's not just circling, she's explaining to me what I'm doing wrong. And it's like, oh no, in Chinese you don't say it this way because this is the type of verb where you split it into two halves and put one at the start of the sentence and one at the end. It's not simple. It's not as there's nothing easy about understanding. And I remember I had a contrast. And here in Canada, by contrast, the way they teach Chinese is they play an audio CD. You have more than 40 students in a classroom. They press play on a CD. You have a photocopied handout, and you select multiple choice, A, B, and C. So if you do that, you'll never get. I mean, I know this is simple, but it still cuts deep. You'll never be able to understand why. Like the Chinese word for interesting, you say, "Oh, this is interesting." They have several different verbs that mean interesting that you have to use in different contexts for different types of things. And, one of my professors said, oh, no, they don't use the word interesting this way. Well, if you don't have the time to sit down, and how are you ever going to progress from that? It's really tough. But no, the photocopied test with the audio CD playing, that's a brick wall for that kind of learning.
Absolutely,
I think that represents a lot of the problems with Western education. Sure.
Yeah, the teachers seem to be more focused on who, what, when, where, and where, but they never seem to be focused on the why or how. They seem to be focused more on description rather than explanation and justification, an emphasis on justification, because that's what gives you the idea and inkling as into the nature of what you're actually doing and what you're trying to achieve.
I have mixed feelings about that, just because our education system now is bad and it has limitations.
Yeah.
And within those limitations, I think there is something positive to be said, even for returning to memorization of brute facts.
Yeah, sure.
In that, you can have a system where you say, look, guys, these are the facts you need to know. This is what's going to be on the test. And, you're free to draw your own conclusions. Maybe we can even have discussion in class or something. But, that's so India, we've been talking a lot about China and Chinese culture, but by contrast, India has a really proud tradition going back 3,000 plus years. Their form of law was based on memorization. So the laws of a country, every distinguished gentleman would have memorized the law. I wish we had law that was that brief today, that you could memorize all the laws of the country you were living in. They'd write them in kind of rhyming couplets and this kind of thing to make it easier to memorize. But the idea of memorizing and reciting text as being fundamental learning. My education was so terrible, we didn't even learn facts. We really didn't. What we really learned was sentimentality. We learned, so if you think about what is the history of Canada? What was impressed upon us were sentiments about openness and fairness and about being better than the Americans and being better than the Spanish and the brotherhood between the English and the French, who used to hate each other, but we don't anymore, and about not being racist. It was really all about sentimentality. And, you know, if you asked any of the students at the end of their education, when did Napoleon die? They can't tell you. And, you know, it does matter. You know, you need to know when and where Napoleon died. Why did Napoleon matter so much for the history of Canada? And, you know, we didn't learn that either. You know, so what was Napoleon's position on slavery? So look, it's a bad system. How to move forward? You know, I'm not sure that I would embrace moving away from the teaching of raw facts. Just given what we've got to work with right now, it could be that in some ways the teacher's role can be improved by liberating them from some of the bullshit they're expected to do, and say, okay, maybe you can have a more limited role of teaching fact, especially if we're going to continue having 40 and 50 students in a classroom.
Absolutely. So my personal thoughts on it is there needs to be some level of triangulation. There needs to be a incorporation between theoretical and practical. If you have any thoughts on that? If you've got any like examples that could perhaps corroborate my idea or perhaps go against it, that'd be.
So look, it's all about budget. I mean, you know, this is the problem. And what you're saying, I mean, you know, so a lot of people, especially left-wingers, have wanted to get kids out of the classroom and put them on the farm and, you know, give them experience of actually applying science in those kinds of contexts. The vegan film director who made Titanic, James Cameron, he has a very tiny school that's all vegan. The food's all vegan there. That's based on that principle where the kids get out and learn how to build a solar panel and how to plant trees. But, you know, so, I mean, I sympathize the impulse to a limited extent. I recently, a couple of years ago, heard a very passionate argument for trying to include computer programming in school education. And they made all these arguments for it. But I do have mixed feelings about that kind of thing where you're teaching practical and hands-on things to youth. I mean, you know, it's very easy for me to justify teaching Aristotle and the theory of democracy to kids, or even, I mean, again, nobody learns, how does City Hall work? How do you take a complaint to City Hall? How do you go to small claims court? How do you go to court and represent yourself? We don't learn that in school. There are all kinds of things like that are philosophical and political that are not involved in school at all. Instead, you learn volleyball. You know, you know, when you get into something like teaching computer programming or teaching how to actually work on a farm, I'm divided because, you know, on the one hand, I can see the in the abstract, what you're saying is the value of having practical experience with things. But on the other hand, you're in effect giving vocational training to people that's going to be relevant to the lives of less than 1% of the students. I just say very briefly, you know, when light bulbs were discovered, it would be easy to say, oh, in the future, everyone's going to be working in a light bulb factory. Like, light bulbs are changing the whole world. And they did. Light bulbs changed the whole world. They changed life. Right now, how many light bulbs are in this room? But how many people do you know who work in the light bulb industry? It's a tiny percentage. And it's sad but true. How many people do you know who actually work on a farm? You can look up the statistics for any given country. It is a shockingly small percentage. News story I promoted on Patreon. We just had 12,000 pigs die when one factory farm caught fire and burnt down in Canada. So 12,000 pigs.
Wow.
The farm had fewer than 1,000 employees. And of course, you know, it's a 24-hour operation. So the number of people, and of course, you know, some of them are in the office. It's mind-blowing. But anyway, very, very small numbers of people are employed, even when you got 12,000 pigs. That's a lot of pig poo. That's a lot of food and a lot of poo and a lot of blood and a lot of misery. Sorry, I'm vegan if the audience doesn't know. But anyway, so that's all. I am of two minds about that. If you talk about having hands-on, and then the other reality is ultimately, look, one of the best systems of education in the world. It's also important just to be open to looking at what's a good system of education. Japan, for childhood education, has one of the best systems of education in the world on a large scale. And Japan is going bankrupt, you know. The government it's very, very seriously at a state of, debt to GDP ratio that's facing bankruptcy. And maybe in the future, we'll look back on this period of Japanese education as a golden age that was lost. So anyway, I just mentioned they are doing a lot of things right in some places on education. And again, I think the Montessori system is a great example. Montessori is not cheap. Having one teacher with 8 students is not cheap.
Yeah.
And we have tough decisions to make.
Absolutely. Do you have any suggestions for books anyone in the audience or even I could read on the subject of philosophy of education?
Wow. Yeah, so that's a great question. I do have a book reviews playlist on my channel.
Excellent.
And there are a couple of those are philosophy of education books. But honestly, it is the most neglected area of philosophy.
I agree.
It's mind-blowing. Yeah. Well, okay, if you want to say more, go ahead. But the funny thing is also philosophy education, there's a lot of money involved because, just a lot of people earn their living as teachers. So you'd really think there'd be more interest and more emphasis on that. But aside from the ancient stuff, reading what Aristotle has to say or Plato has to say is interesting in its way, but it's utterly irrelevant. I mean, again, there was this other kind of brief burst of interest in philosophy of education with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he is both a figure in the turning point of Europe's history in terms of democracy, but the major influence he had in his own lifetime was actually philosophy of education. But today, it's just horseshit. I mean, it has no salience. Sorry, same with no offense to Aristotle and Plato, but it has no relevance at all to education in our times.
Yeah.
So I just mentioned, so I can say something positive, but it's amazing how poor the literature is on philosophy of education. What I wonder, I've never found a book like this. I'm betting someone wrote a book about the history of education in Scotland. And one of the things I really learned in the last year and a half is Scotland was a unique and important place in exactly this respect, that the history of education in Scotland was different from England and significantly different from any other part of Europe. Yeah. So the transformation in public education and universal education and so on, it really happened in Scotland, not in Italy. Italy was a more advanced country in every way, not in France, what have you. It happened first in Scotland. So probably someone, whether it's an academic article or a mainstream book, probably there is some reasonably philosophical reflection on how this came about in Scotland. I looked at the history as much as I could while I was in China this last year. And it seems to me one element that's probably neglected was just the emergence of one language in Scotland. They started off, everyone was speaking these different isolated languages that nobody else spoke anywhere in the world, these Scottish languages that were of no use even in England. And then they engaged with Latin. They tried to make Latin their unifying language. And then eventually they gave up and made English the unifying language of education. But the struggle for universal education, the belief in education, and I mentioned this to my Chinese students also, the Scottish had a culture of shaming you if you weren't educated, of shaming you if you weren't a member of a book club. It wasn't good enough to be a farmer or a factory worker or a soldier, that you should be a member of a book club and should be reading serious nonfiction or whatever, that you should care about the issues of your day and be reading. And it's quite Scottish culture is still quite nasty that way.
Yeah.
In America, people won't really tell you you're stupid to your face. So I'd say the history of education in Scotland is probably really worth studying. And then, and that's over a couple of centuries. I think there's an open question. Maybe someone has done a book about education, for example, in Switzerland and what's gone right there. But that'll be very recent. That'll be just since World War II. What's going right in Switzerland. But yeah, I'd say that's, in terms of the philosophical questions being asked and answered, that might be where you'll find something worth reading.
Have you read anything from Oxford that, like, say, for instance, because I've come across a book called the Oxford Handbook to the Philosophy of Education. Have you read anything along those lines?
I have. Both Oxford and Cambridge in the UK have made attempts at that. But I think it was actually Cambridge who tried to do a whole series for specifically political philosophy. And I remember going through that. But what is this a new series? Maybe you can tell me about it. Is it great or is it terrible? Because most of those projects turn out terribly.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I've looked in the table of contents and I've read a little bit of the introduction. This is quite a while back because I was looking as hard as I could for good books on the introduction, or as an introduction to the philosophy of education, but I couldn't find any. Right. All I found was that old one by Rousseau, and I found one from Oxford. none from Cambridge. The one from Oxford seemed to have more of a political spin on education rather than delving into the actual in-depth, fundamental, foundational philosophy of education. So, yeah, do you think most of these books have most of like more of a political spin? And do you think that's different?
So look, one of the other things that's kind of taboo in our system of education is to talk about the motivation of the author. You're not supposed to say things that are ad hominem. But in most of these cases, these books are being written for a reason. And that may be really antithetical to your philosophical interest. Like, I mean, you're saying you want to get at the foundations of why is education taught this way? How did these assumptions come to be built up? And there are, I mean, most of them raise very uncomfortable truths. You know, why do we ring a bell to bring children in from the schoolyard? I have read it claimed that was based on the Pavlov's dog experiments, that you could train dogs to respond to ringing bells. This kind of, some of these things raise, uncomfortable truths. The development of education and the role of, kind of heavy-handed role of the state and forced assimilation and making people into good military recruits. I mean, definitely in continental Europe, the first emergence of scientific or rational education was military education. Because before that, I just mentioned, before you have centralized education, what you have are isolated tutors, and they're mostly teaching, medieval, Christian materials, and then also things that aristocrats value, like dancing and playing instruments and really useless kind of stuff. And then as mathematics and science become more important in war, for instance, metallurgy, being able to make metal becomes incredibly important. But also things like being able to angle a cannon and shoot a cannonball and do logistics. They started needing math and science education for the military. So in many parts of Europe, the first steps forward were in the military. So anyway, my point was, this is just a digression, but being really honest about the history and philosophy of education may be totally antithetical to the author's motive in writing the book.
Yeah.
Something similar is true, when you do the philosophy of medicine and history of medical science. It's really dark. It's really depressing, the stuff you get into. And, a lot of it's about, kind of covering up dead bodies and, things that were done wrong and killed huge numbers of people over long periods of time, and stupid ideas that never got challenged. Where it's like, again, it seems like right up until the 1970s, we were in the dark ages. It's just amazing how terrible the history of medicine is until really recently. And when we did get something right, it was luck. We discovered the cure, well, not even the cure for malaria, which we discovered a treatment for malaria by sheer luck, and never understood the scientific principles and so on. See, but if you want to read about that history, you need an author who's really honest about it, or who's a critic of medical history, who's going to show you all the staggering, down the path of progress, and not someone who's trying to sell you a dream. And I think, this is one of the other problems with philosophy of education, is who's really going to deal with this? Who's really going to deal with it? Because, look, ultimately, all these things, we have to learn from failure. Even the examples of humanitarian work, fundamentally, we have to learn from failure. But if you're not going to be honest about that failure, we're not going to learn. A large part of philosophy is propaganda, and probably philosophy of education is one of the most, propaganda-heavy areas of philosophy.
Which is a shame, but it is what it is. Hopefully, I'll be able to start making some contributions to the subject, because that's honestly one of the most interesting subjects, at least for me, to actually understand the nature of these things. So, but when it comes to my dreams, I don't just want to reconstruct the education system. I think another imperative part of reconstructing the education system would be also to reconstruct the research system, how we conduct ourselves in doing research, which would also have great implications to the economic structure of society. Like, say, for instance, in Japan's case, I think it may be the folly or failure of the economists that they're going into financial turmoil. So if they perhaps had a better research system, a more robust approach to social science, they would also not be failing as hard as they are in the financial sector, perhaps. So I think it's a very necessary part to not only just focus on reconstructing the education system when you're doing such a thing, you also need to focus on the other fundamental parts to a functioning society. So let's actually move on. I want to learn more about you, Isel. Let's first start talking about what exactly your fundamental beliefs are when it comes to, say, for instance, discerning facts about reality. Let's start off as basic as that. So let's start off with what do you think our ability to know the world around us is? And let's use the vehicle of epistemology or metaphysics even. What approach to reality do you have? Are you a naturalist? Are you a supernaturalist? What kinds of ideologies, philosophically speaking, do you use to base your judgment and attitudes to the world?
I think, so I could be called a skeptic. So this sounds like a bad joke. People now say classical liberal. It's becoming the butt of jokes. Can I say classical skeptic? But I mean, the really ancient meaning of skeptic, which is in the philosophy of Sextus Empiricus. In that sense, I can say my epistemological approach is skeptical, not in the sort of 21st century internet use of the word skeptic. But I just see a lot of the problems of epistemology. They're implicitly or explicitly directed towards the question of faith in God. They're about faith in things unseen. It's very rare that we're really taking sort of the the framework of the tools of epistemology and seriously inquiring into, is this apple orange or is it red?
Yeah.
And, if I perceive it as red and you perceive it as, how do we truly know what is red and what's orange? Okay, these are problems we can solve. So I think a lot of the pessimism about empirical knowledge in the European tradition is trumped up in order to create a basis for belief in God or a belief in abstractions, truth, beauty, valor, justice, universal human rights, or what have you. But it is most of the time it's God. And to give an example, a guy like Wittgenstein, his philosophy of language, it's simply a basis for monotheism. And again, people who don't know that or don't pick up on that don't realize what the text is doing. But this isn't just talking about the meaning of words for the sake of meaning of words. Again, I'd say Immanuel Kant, Critique of Pure Reason. Again, it actually is a theological work in that sense. Its final purposes. So to say a little bit about what I mean when I say Sextus Empiricus, that the claim made by Sextus Empiricus is, when we really inquire into things thoroughly, we don't come to certainty or uncertainty. We come to a kind of equanimity, because we're comfortable or we're aware of what it is we cannot know or how uncertain our knowledge is.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even say equanimity. I'm willing to say doubt. I'm willing to say that you can have a dynamic kind of attitude of inquiry and doubt. And you've already heard me say in a particular applied context, I think that's a better way to live than constructing abstract beliefs. But so you asked the question, what can we know? I don't think there's any doubt about the extent to which we can know that an apple is red. And, your sense of when does something stop being red and start being orange, it really is subjective. But again, this isn't actually a problem anyone philosophically or politically is struggling with. We can get into all the problems we really are struggling with. When I was in China, it's really when you have deep cultural divisions that the perception of color is going to be different. I owned a jacket. It was the same jacket I was married in.
Mm-hmm.
And I have different photographs of me wearing this jacket on the internet because I had it for such a long time. And I perceived it as black. And all of the Chinese people around me perceived it as green. And it blew my mind. I was talking to my teacher, and I'm talking in Chinese. And I was like, I'm saying to her Chinese, green? You think this jacket's green? How can you possibly think this jacket's green? And I opened the door to the classroom, and there was another teacher, and I said to her Chinese, pardon me, this jacket, what color would you say it is? And she said green. When the lunch break came, I went to lunch, and there were other white people eating lunch there. I said, what, do you think this jacket is green? No, it's black.
Yeah.
So, this kind of epistemological problem can exist. Obviously, this is a culturally constructed notion of color, and the perception is different. Also, we can use a mass spectrometer or a laser or something, and measure how much light reflects off this surface and where does it fit on the spectrum. We can scientifically define when exactly does it start being black or start being green. But most of the questions about your optimism or pessimism, they're not about empirical knowledge.
Yeah.
They're exactly about the steps beyond empirical knowledge to abstractions. So really briefly, I think the sickness of our society is that people are taught from an early age to believe that is a step from something unreal to something more real. So even somebody like Immanuel Kant does that. the presumption is that we have phenomenological reality, the empirical reality of what we see as our senses, and then whatever's beyond that is something transcendent, transcendental, more real than merely the redness of the apple or the greenness of my jacket. And already in Schopenhauer, so Schopenhauer is not a nihilist, but you have this fundamental idea when we're talking about an abstraction, we're talking about less information than something we perceive empirically. And to me, that was a fundamental, well, I already understood that. I didn't have the words for it, but it's a fundamental step forward for anyone to take if you're raised kind of in normal Western culture, where you realize that when we start dealing with abstractions, we're dealing with human created conventions that are less information, not more. It's not like Plato's theory of forms. It's not the true good or the true beauty or the true justice or the true God. We're moving away from exactly what we can know into something that's unknowable, but obviously, to some extent in language useful. I mean, as we said before, I can use the word rubber, and even that word can be terribly misleading, when I talk about rubber crops in Laos. So yeah, and that's obviously the theater, and that's one of the senses. Many people will say to you that studying philosophy is useless. But one of the great things about politics is that it shows you the ways in which philosophy really does make you sharp. Like you're able to say, well, rubber doesn't mean rubber. Actually, in this context, rubber has two meanings.
Yes.
I think politics, in that sense, makes the study of philosophy more rewarding, because this isn't just a parlor game of debating how do we truly know that an apple is red.
Yeah. So let's talk more about skepticism. Would you call yourself Pyrrhonian, or do you call yourself methodical?
Well, so look, it's really Pyrrho. I don't think he has extant works. I mean, so the memory of what Pyrrho's philosophy was, we know through Sextus Empiricus. Maybe there are some little fragments, but I mean, I guess the short answer is I'm Pyrrhonian. But I mean, so to give a parallel example, when I talked to Isaac, known as Ask Yourself on the internet, so Isaac's an internet personality. His YouTube channel is called Ask Yourself. He said of himself that he considered himself only a descriptive nihilist and not a prescriptive nihilist.
Yeah.
And then, he discussed what that meant to him and so on. And I said to him, oh, well, I think actually in your terms, I would be a prescriptive nihilist, not just a descriptive one. And I think that's the sense in which I'm not any of the forms of classical skeptic, is that it's not merely a descriptive skepticism or an analytical skepticism. Actually, it's prescriptive. That really what I'm putting forward is a kind of moral claim. You ought to prescriptively. This is the way you ought to live. And in a sense that also kind of loosens it up on you in another way, because we all have to live with a certain level of pragmatic belief.
Yeah.
What is and what isn't a good saucepan. And you can say, okay, look, there are some parts of my life where I'm aware I'm relying on crude dogma. Even geographically, I can't really apply my skepticism to all politics all over the world. Yeah. Sometimes, I hear a news report about something going on in Africa where I really don't know. I don't respond to it as skeptically as I do something from Cambodia, but I'm aware I have that self-discipline. Okay, on the basis of this one newspaper article that may be bullshit, this is the situation of what's happening in Africa. But I can't be a good skeptic all the time. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. So do you think, on the subject of skepticism, because you're familiar with the subject, the problem of skepticism, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it's even possible for us to solve all those problems? Just the epistemic regress, is that a problem that's even solvable? And if it was to be solved, what kind of implications do you think that would have on us as a society?
Okay, so this is quite alien to me. I had a friend who was in philosophy academically, and he would refer to the problem of skepticism and the problem of nihilism as if they were self-evident things. Yeah. But there really is a sense of my not understanding what you mean. Now, okay, if someone is a theologian, if they believe in the monotheistic God, then it's very clear what they mean, that they can't have knowledge of God or can't have knowledge of good and evil, right? Now, I don't think it's a problem that we can't know whether or not the apple is red, or that anyone's saying they can't know if apples exist at all. I mean, maybe that is the problem. If you want to, we can talk about that. Like, do we know an apple exists? But I don't think that's the issue. And my response, whether you're talking about something abstract like good and evil, something abstract like the monotheistic God or what have you, with all these abstractions, I recently used the comparison of a speed limit. I don't believe speed limits exist. They're not real, but they're cultural conventions we create and we agree upon. And actually, even the colors are probably like that. We've already mentioned this. The concept of what exactly is green, what is red, and what is brown, these things will vary. They're different in China than they are in Canada, the United States, or England. So he's bid me to keep talking, and he'll be right back. I assume you guys at home can see that he's not on camera at the moment. Maybe not. Anyway, with engaging with abstractions, the fact that I can't know what is good, what is evil, or any of these other kind of supernal fixed abstractions, for me, that is a non-problem, in the same sense that it's incoherent, that it's not a non-problem. If someone asks, how do you know the true speed limit? There is no true speed limit. Speed limits aren't something that exists in a supernal or fixed form. Speed limits are something that we can agree upon as a cultural convention. It's an idea we can create, we can draw out of thin air, and obviously we do it for various pragmatic purposes, to try to save people's lives, maybe to have better ecology or what have you as we go. All right. So I'm now filling for time as Darren comes back to the table. But, in as much as in the Western tradition, people have tend to look at philosophy as a search for truth with a capital T, as something abstract, something more real than merely empirical reality, where they can reach beyond empirical experience and lay their hands on the truth of the capital T. That's not my conception of philosophy, so I don't share those problems. Sorry. So in the same sense that I'm not worried about knowing the true or real speed limit, I'm not worried about knowing the true or real difference between good and evil. Yeah.
Okay, so like in our discussion before we had on Discord, I think from that like really in-depth run through of your ideologies, I came to the conclusion that it seemed like you were a philosophical pragmatist, a quasi-realist, and you had some sort of was it a relativistic type framework of morality?
Okay. Well, can I just ask what any of that means to you? So when you say I'm a pragmatist, does that mean anything particular to you? I mean, I do know the kind of Wikipedia definition of pragmatism, but what?
So, like in the sense that you treat philosophy as a very as something that just gives us a better idea of how to apply critical thinking or what have you in like an academic sense or in a scientific sense, that is only used as a specific tool, not necessarily a subject that in and of itself is like a useful thing. Like it's only supposed to be some sort of residue of the sciences, or perhaps I'm thinking about logical empiricism. But like and I'll actually ask you a question about that later. But a pragmatist, yeah. So they
historically Europe.
Yeah.
One of the medieval concept of philosophy that continued, I don't know, up to the 18th century was philosophy as the handmaiden of theology.
Yeah.
So where philosophy was really linked to the church and what it was doing. And then what superseded that was the concept of philosophy as the queen of the sciences.
Yes.
So, for example, as I recall, the PhD thesis of Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, was some remarks on the on the behavior of fire. Some remarks on the behavior of fire, as I recall. And there was a debate between Schopenhauer and Hegel about the behavior of a horse's legs while running, whether or not all of the legs of the horse were ever off the ground, or if they always had one foot on the ground, this kind of thing. So, there was a period of trying to package philosophy as the queen of the sciences. It's interesting to me that in Aristotle already, there's instead the fundamental idea that politics is the queen of the sciences, that the top of the apex, the ultimate, philosophy or technique or area of study ultimately is how these things contribute to how are we going to organize, a society. and indeed who's in power and who gets what, who's rich and who's poor, etc. So, look, sure, if someone's approaching me from philosophy of sciences, I can see why they see me as a pragmatist. But it's true, my purpose is never really scientific. I mean, look, to keep the contrast, I remember I read a passionate essay about linguistics in Laos. So a lot of what I've done is also overlaps with linguistics in Laos, indigenous people in Canada, in Asia, and various languages. And this guy made this passionate statement that, linguistics is a science and its fundamental purpose and objective is to provide a complete description of all the methods of communication on planet Earth, And I remember just reading that and thinking, I have absolutely no interest in being in that field. You know what I mean? Like this is if that's what linguistics is, I'm not part of the field of linguistics. This seems, and I mean, I think that is a scientific conception. If someone works in the study of insects or fish or something, and they say, well, what we want to do is explore the whole of the ocean and provide an encyclopedic description of every single fish that ever swam in the ocean, maybe going back into the fossil record up to today. I understand that, but that's not my view of life on Earth. I mean, that's not the way I think of philosophy or politics. So sure, I mean, you could say I'm a pragmatist, but obviously it's ultimately all of it comes down to a kind of political and moral purpose. Sure.
Yeah. So what would you say is your moral purpose? To perhaps use as a vehicle to explain what that moral purpose is. What is your moral framework? What do you actually subscribe to when it comes to ethical theories?
Right. So my delusion is that I don't have one. My delusion is that I'm strong enough to stand with no moral framework whatsoever. Yeah. So I know you've already seen the video, and I think most people, or anyway, many people I've spoken to, they reject that. They think, oh no, well that's impossible. You must have one, and you're just in denial about it. But I gave you the example. I know you've already seen the video. So I'm going to say very briefly of a man who sees a cow in a field, and you ask the question, would you get down on your hands and knees and drink the milk out of this cow's udder? Now, I don't think I need a moral framework to kind of answer this question and deal with this scenario. I went to do humanitarian work in Laos. And by the way, I did a lot of research. I learned a lot, but the actual amount of humanitarian work I did was relatively modest. So by the way, I'm not boasting that I accomplished a lot in human. I learned a lot, but the amount of humanitarian difference I made was very, very small. Nevertheless, okay, so Laos is a country that's literally full of craters because it's been bombed so heavily by the United States. It may or may not be the #1 most bombed country on planet Earth in the history of the world. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos than were dropped on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. That's how it was bombed. So, you can look at that and be like, now, do I need a moral framework to, obviously there were other factors here. It's to say, okay, this is a problem. What can I do to improve it? Kind of what can I do to help? What positive role I can play? Now, look, I think partly this has to do with your analysis of human nature and to what extent human nature does vary between individuals. I think, I don't know if I could say most people or most philosophers. I mean, maybe most philosophers would say, well, gee, Eisel, the majority of white men who go to Laos just want to get drunk and smoke opium. There's a lot of opium tourism. People go there to smoke drugs and marijuana, but also opium or use other drugs. They want to go to discos and they want to sleep with prostitutes. You can see why the majority of people are going to Laos. And you, Eisel, me, I went there. I did historical research. I was looking at, ancient stone inscriptions, handwritten manuscripts. I was studying languages. I was studying politics and philosophy, and I was trying to do humanitarian work. So therefore, ipso facto, the difference must be that you have some kind of belief, maybe a religious belief or ethical, or some kind of framework that differentiates you from those people. That sounds like an excuse to me. That sounds to me like a way of not really dealing with, what the difference is. And I think the real difference might be more disturbing. So an unrelated, but I think meaningful comparison. You may
Yeah.
have noticed that a lot of people just want to dismiss Adolf Hitler as insane, and maybe it's more disturbing to deal with the fact that he was wrong, but made decisions, in the same kind of way that you and I do. That his manner of thinking was not, was not so different. Maybe it's more disturbing to understand that. So, I mean, the difference between people and how they play out. I understand why some people would assume this is because of a really strictly posited, moral framework. And even looking at things like desire. And I mean, sorry, let's just say again, being a nihilist, this doesn't mean that I believe, or sorry, here's this word believe again. Obviously, there are even aesthetic differences between people that can run tremendously deep. So I've known gay people in my life, but I'm entirely heterosexual. I've also known bisexual people. And, it's not a belief. It's not a difference in moral framework or ideology. And even on an aesthetic level, there is a sense in which they perceive the world, differently from I do. They see beauty in men and so on when I don't, and what have you. The way they perceive and the way they feel is actually different.
Yeah.
Now, so if we really ask the question, why is it that I look at the bomb craters in Laos and the history and I mean, obviously I'm using the bomb craters just as a symbol for the whole political and historical situation. It's not like I literally just looked at a photograph of bomb. Why do I look at it and respond to that as an opportunity for humanitarian work and research? And somebody else responds to it literally going there to find cheap prostitutes. And
Yeah.
the guys looking for cheap prostitutes, they outnumber me by about 1,000 to 1. In this case, maybe I've chosen a good example. It's not because they're members of a different religion from me. It's not because they're Catholic and I'm atheist. I mean, if the roles were reversed, maybe you'd say that or something. But it doesn't. It's not because they're Muslim and I'm a nihilist or something. To get into why that is, I think it might be more disturbing. And obviously, this is a difference between people that's quite a bit more common than the difference between Adolf Hitler and you and I. Yeah.
So would you say the more important discussion would be about psychology rather than morality when it comes to diagnosing and telling us what we need to do to people like this, like Adolf Hitler? Is it just more important to talk about the psychology than the morality, just in general?
Well, look, okay. I guess this is maybe struck on one of the ways in which I was influenced by Schopenhauer, just because Schopenhauer makes the will and desire, so central to our discourse. Differences in what I desire are not differences in what I believe. And again, already even something like homosexuality versus heterosexuality, aesthetic differences, and that I see this as a learning opportunity and an opportunity to humanitarian work, as opposed to anything else. I don't think those fall under the rubric of belief or faith or even moral framework. But okay, in terms of a moral framework, I do say to people all the time, what I talk about is doing the best you can. Which I think is different from trying to do good or trying to serve the will of God or, nationalism or some other abstract. And again, I think part of the tragedy of life is understanding that many of the people whom you may perceive as evil are, from their perspective, trying to do the best they can. And in most cases, they're struggling to make money the only way they know how or the way they're most familiar with. So obviously, as a vegan, I mean, I just saw some footage of people cutting down a forest in Indonesia and killing orangutans. But whether you're looking at cutting down a forest or running a slaughterhouse, the reality is, I mean, I'm totally open to questions of good and evil. It's not like I'm saying these words should be taken out of the dictionary.
Yeah.
We all know that most of what we're dealing with are people who are trying to live a good life and trying to live a meaningful life and are struggling to do the best they can and are earning money the way they know how. And they're not questioning, they're not questioning a lot of things there. And, but even the flip side of that, they're probably also spending money the only way they know how. I mean, people want to be happy and people want to be loved. And if they do that by getting drunk and sleeping with prostitutes, that's the same. That's the same set of impulses. That's the same attempt to find a solution to these problems. And so again, my pretense, my claim is that I'm living without a moral framework. And if I'm wrong, then I think the sense in which I'm wrong is going to be at such a low level. It's going to be at such a low level of cognition that I might as well be right. Yeah. I do believe red is red and green is green and black is black. There are,
Yeah.
But yeah, but I don't think. But so my point was, I don't think doing the best you can is something that separates me from those guys who are on permanent vacation and going to the sort of, because they also in their way are doing the best they can, and that's probably why. But that's probably why people are so afraid of new ideas like veganism.
Yeah.
You present to someone, hey, look, there's another way to live. There's another way to spend your money, maybe another way to earn money. Hey, there's another way, because most of these people already care about ecology. Well, there's another way to solve that problem. There's another way to have an impact. And a lot of people you can see respond, they don't want to know about it. Because as soon as they do know about it, now there's this, weight up, there's this onus on them to change, to start living more in alignment with what it is they know. Yeah.
No, it seems to me that you perhaps fall in line with a type of moral intuitionism. So, like, how would you be able to say to anyone else if they were doing something that's outright wrong, or perhaps outright not in their own best interest, despite them saying clearly that they want to do something, if it's going to go, if their actions are going to go in the exact opposite direction of that? How exactly do you approach them in a way that actually tells them that what they're doing isn't actually in their best interest? How do you do that?
Okay, so I don't consider myself an intuitionist.
Okay.
But I'll give you a pragmatic example. I think this is answering your question. So look, I've given you the example that I don't believe in speed limits, but there's a sense in which I do believe it. Like, i.e., I think it is a good thing to have speed limits. I just don't think they really exist. They're a cultural convention. There's something we create, and there's something we create against a blank canvas. There isn't some objectively real standard we can work against. Okay, now almost everyone believes that pedophilia is evil, bad, wrong, that it should be illegal. There is actually no consensus on what is the age of consent. At what age does pedophilia stop being a crime? And also interestingly, there's no consensus, if we learn internationally, how many years in prison does the crime result in? Now, you might think there'd be a universal standard. You might think the whole world would have the same year, but like speed limits, I mean, the point is there's an understanding that there should be a limit somewhere, and then we're going to create a limit. And whatever limit we create is in a sense arbitrary, right? Should the speed limit be 65 or 70 or 55 or 30 or 100? They're possible. But the most fundamental assumption here, which isn't going to exist in every society, is that there's one speed limit for everyone, that there's one age of consent for everyone. Even that we could throw out. No, but even that we throw out. We could say, okay, you have a better car because you drive this type of car. The speed limit is 80 for you. You have a better driver's license. You passed the test. You drive it. You're a grade A driver. For you, the speed limit is 80. But for him, he has a worse driver's license. For him, it's 60. You could have that kind of system, right? But the deep assumption is one way or another, people are going to come together. They're going to discuss this, and then they're going to set the limit. So in seeing that as arbitrary and culturally conventional and existing in written law and so on, that's, I don't think there's any intuition involved. If there were a moral intuition, these things would presumably be universal, or there'd be no debate, or there'd be no real role for democracy in them. And even something like murder. I mean, when you get into details of even something as simple as murder. How many years do you go to prison for murder for? There actually is no international, or even it's not something easily decided at all. I mean, okay, you want to get to something so broad that murder is bad. Well, yeah, and then you get into what is the difference between first-degree murder and second-degree murder, and what if it's a thief who broke into your house? I mean, you can get into these kinds of details. So no, I wouldn't identify as an intuitionist. And again, my perspective is being a nihilist means that I'm much more able to deal with these questions and contradict. To me, they're not contradictions. So really briefly, but I think this puts a human face on it.
Yeah.
I had an employer, so he was my boss. He was my boss at work. And he had for decades, you could tell he'd been telling the same story again and again. He was an old man.
Yeah.
He had for decades at cocktail parties been stating his opinion that he thought the age of consent should be lowered dramatically. He thought the age of consent should be when a girl has her period. And he alluded to, there are various ancient cultures. A lot of ancient cultures, people got married at 13 years old or what have you.
Yeah.
There were pre-modern cultures. This is normal. And, he did this in a kind of self-congratulatory way. Now, I think nobody in his life had ever challenged his belief. He dealt with Christian, kind of standard, ideologue, true believer responses. Some people think it should be 18 or 16 or whatever, or people who just yelled at him, what have you. And, the way I responded to him, this is closer to Socratic method. I asked him, what kind of a society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where it's not safe for 13-year-old girls to go with a group of their friends to McDonald's? Like, they can't go to a McDonald's without their father accompanying them, or an uncle or a male, because fully grown men can hit on them and seduce them, where that's culturally and legally acceptable. I accept that it's a completely artificial contrivance, like the speed limit. You can set it at 16 or 18. That only at a certain age is it acceptable for men to start seducing young women, right? And again, it could be 21. I don't think anywhere on earth it's 21, but I don't know. But whether it's 19 or 18 or 16 or whatever it's going to be. But what this creates is a culture where girls can go unaccompanied to McDonald's, and it's understood by everyone they're not going to flirt with them. They're not going to engage in. They're not going to attempt to seduce them.
Yeah.
Right? So again, this is like a speed limit. A speed limit benefits us all. It changes, the way we live in society. Now, so this was a nihilistic response. You notice this is not based on good and evil, and this is not even based on the presumption of the victim suffering, right? Because as you know, there will be counterexamples. There will be some example of someone at 13 who got married and was totally happy or whatever. I mean, people are going to be able to make understand. So, and this is not based on any of that. And I think I can say he was a little bit devastated by this. The conversation went on from there. So again, I don't think this is intuitionism. I think this is a kind of rigorously rational approach that proceeds from believing in nothing to believing in nothing, but along the way, shows up what the options are. Now, sorry, and then look, final conclusion. With speed limits and with the age of consent, and with how we're going to treat murder, there are going to be measurable outcome differences. So early in the conversation, I was saying to you, well, if you look at philosophy of education, you got to measure the outcomes. If you do humanitarian work, you got to look at the outcomes. If the speed limit is too high, a lot of people are going to die. If the age of consent is too high, like if it's 21, too many people are going to be going to prison, or something. Everyone's going to be going to prison because they start having sex at 19, and that's illegal because the age of consent is 21. Obviously there are going to be measurable outcomes. So in saying it's arbitrary and so on, but this kind of discussion is going to guide us to making a reasonable decision. It's not going to guide us towards a distinction between good and evil.
Yeah. True enough. So why because you have this very nihilistic approach to things, which I think is commendable. It seems to be very intellectually honest. That's definitely something that I'm struck by. But why do you think people have such a negative attitude towards nihilists in the first place?
Yeah. So nihilism had one period where it was regarded positively, and that was the period of Russian nihilism before the revolution. So there was a time when nihilism had a good name. And one of the slogans was, and this slogan still means something to me, go to the poor, be the poor.
Yeah.
So that's interesting in itself. Because, nihilism, you might think their in case you expect their slogan to be, forget it, just live in luxury for yourself or something. No, nihilism is not necessarily linked to narrow self-interest or self-indulgence or what have you. I think there's an interesting argument that some other philosophies like libertarianism may be linked to, that kind of tendency. but that the charitable impulse was there from the first. So nihilism actually had a relatively good reputation for that one period in Russia. And then once the communists came to power, they started vilifying the nihilists and indeed hunting them down and killing them, because they killed just about everyone who didn't support the Bolsheviks in the Revolutionary and Civil War period. And things didn't get a lot better after that with Lenin and Stalin and so on. So they were written down negative way in terms of the history books. You know, does nihilism have a worse name today than skepticism or atheism? I mean, look, I feel confident that I can defend myself when people have a low opinion of me, a bad opinion of me, when I describe myself as a nihilist. I notice that the government of China describes their enemy, the enemy of communism in China, as historical nihilism. That's the term they use for the opposite of communism. So for me, part of it is saying, okay, that's exactly what I am. You know what's funny? You say the opposite of having faith in communism is historical nihilism. Well, that's me. Well, I'm exactly someone who looks at the lessons of history and sees that there's nothing to believe in there. I feel I'm learning the lessons of history, and I'm rejecting your totalitarian system of belief. So what I'm hopeful of is that in its small way, exactly the repression nihilism has had in Russia, it's real. In China, it's more abstract and hypothetical. That can become something positive that can blossom and that we can kind of identify with positively. Those of us for whom basically atheism is not enough and skepticism is not enough. And I just mentioned even specifically someone like Max Stirner, who he's self-described as an egoist. I feel that that's also not enough. I don't think it's challenging enough for me or challenging enough for society.
Now, back to the question of do you call yourself a prescriptive nihilist? There are actually two approaches to that. You can call yourself a prescriptive nihilist in the sense that you believe people ought to be a nihilist, but you can also call yourself a prescriptive nihilist in the sense that you believe there's no such thing as oughts. So would you say that you agree with both of them?
Okay. So look, earlier on in the discussion, it was clear I put a lot of value on democracy. I mean, I think the real question is not do you believe in ought, but do you believe in coercion, ultimately by state power or the law? I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And I mentioned this is not totally abstract because, for example, the anarcho-capitalists and the libertarians, there are people who oppose that, right? Now, what I believe in strongly, I do see a really large sphere of acceptable use of force and regulation and how else to put it, use of coercion to bring about change and progress. You and I both, we didn't even challenge each other. We talked about education. We both totally assume that if parents are raising their child illiterate, the government has the right to say, no, your kid's going to learn how to read. You know, if parents are against reading, forget it. If the parents don't want their kid to use soap, kid is going to learn in class soap prevents illness. This is not this is mandatory. I mean, one of my favorite examples to use is sewage treatment. Anarcho-capitalists believe you should be allowed to dump your poo in the river. I don't believe that. I totally believe it. I totally support the policy of coercing people into flushing their poo into the sewage system and having scientific sewage treatment. So I mean, okay. So this is abstract question. So I will answer your question though about the abstract ought. So in the real world, the real ought is coercion, is state power, is law. I care a lot about democracy, but I'm not a libertarian. I'm not an anarchist. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist or what have you. I think, we come to conclusions like if people drink water that has poo in it, they get cholera. So we're not going to allow people to dump their sewage in the water, apart from ecological and other concerns. So, okay, so that's the real world ought, is dealing with coercion.
And would you say you have a disdain for anarchists, just very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, do you have a disdain for anarchists? And if so, for any particular reason?
I'll just write down abstract ought to come back to it.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the way I feel about that, one of the first videos I made on utilitarianism, it's still up on I think all my videos are still up on my channel. I don't know if I've deleted much of anything. Couple of I've over 900 videos. But anyway, one of the first ones, I said something which may be shallow, but is true about utilitarianism. And I'm going to say it here about anarchism too. I pointed out, look, when you look at any of the major ethical and political questions of our generation or of several centuries, when has the position of the utilitarians mattered? Did the utilitarians have a position on the Vietnam War that mattered, or X, Y, and Z when you go through the list? And I think that really is a challenge to anarchism also. Now, anarchism is a relatively enormous movement compared to utilitarianism. I mean, utilitarianism it's a couple of people in academia, and there's kind of nothing else to show for it. Anarchists, they do manage to get enough people together to have a riot every so often and this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, when you asked about, your question was posed as disdain. That is a reason to have disdain for anarchism. Now, anarchism, I think, is a philosophy that can work as a critique, but as a critique only. So, the same way, I mean, Catholicism can work as a critique. You can read a criticism of the injustices of life in Saudi Arabia written by a dogmatic Catholic who's really just trying to push to convert people to Christianity. That's their bias. But it's still a totally good report on how fucked up Saudi Arabian society is, how these things should change. So, the fact that someone's ideologically wrong when their philosophy stated positively doesn't mean that they can't use it productively when stated negatively when using a critique. So anarchism can be very productive as a critique. However, anarchists cannot even deal with these types of questions we've just talked about. Okay, how is sewage treatment going to work? And most of the time, the response I get from anarchists is just to guffaw and do engage in hand waving. How, the value of liberty and freedom is so great. How can you possibly, contrast it to, sewage treatment? I said, well, that's exactly what I have to do. I don't believe in an abstract notion called freedom. I'm a nihilist. I don't believe in your God. And I don't believe in sacrificing sewage treatment on the altar of your bloodthirsty God, and whatever you have in mind when you say freedom. I also can use the word freedom. Again, it's not taken out of the dictionary for me. People getting cholera and dying, having to poo in a bucket and dump the bucket in the river. That's not really what I'm thinking about when I think about freedom. I don't think it's what you are either. If you're the anarchist, in reality, they're probably deluding themselves. So no, let's get serious. Let's really talk about sewage treatment. And let's talk about public education. Let's talk about all the things that really. Let's talk about how prisons are run and operated. To me, those are very, very fundamental questions that anarchism utterly fails to deal with. So that's another reason to have some degree of contempt for anarchism. Okay, so coming back to your earlier question that I wrote down, do that again in case. So I talked about the real world ought, which comes down to state power. The abstract ought. Okay. When people ask about the existence of an abstract thought, what they really mean is there a characteristic of ought, that we ought to do something that is true for all people in all times, in all cultures? That is what they mean. They don't mean, is there something I personally feel I ought to do? I ought to clean the dishes. I ought to, I ought to buy groceries. Nobody is questioning that. The question is of what I would call a supernal ought, or an objectively real ought. Now, you've already heard me say, I don't really believe there's an objectively real difference between red and brown, or between green and black, that exists for everyone in all cultures. Now, I also think it's a problem. I don't think that cognitively impedes us. It leads to some funny situations once in a while. I don't believe there's an objectively real distinction between where the speed limit is at, but it's somewhere, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So no, I don't believe in that sense in an abstract ought. But again, the reverse is, right, we come together, we have these cultural conventions, we have laws, we have, state coercion and so on. And, you can talk about ought, and you can talk about requirements within those contexts. If you have chosen to build a bridge, that's a choice. You don't have to build a bridge. You can choose not to build. You can have a boat going forth. Okay, what ought we to do with this bridge? right away you get into requirements that make sense. Look, if the bridge is going to be this long, it has to be this high, it has to be this strong, it has to have this budget. You might want to have a lower budget. You might make it cheaper. No, if it's too cheap, it's going to be dangerous. So we have requirements and oughts that are true within this context and with these cultural conventions, et cetera, et cetera. But no, an absolute ought or a universal ought obviously does not exist, and it exists much less than an absolute speed limit or an absolute and universal difference between red and brown. Yeah.
Would you say that you favor discussions of law and virtue over typical discussions of morality and the myopic oughts that seem to be brought up as a result of people believing in things like utilitarianism or even deontology?
Well, I mean, look, there's a difference between kind of chalkboard philosophy and real world philosophy where it has consequences. On the chalkboard, I guess I understand why people get hung up on these things, and they ask and they demand to know, is it possible for me to convince others of my morality, for someone else to share my sense of ought? And that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Is it possible for me to convince you, Darren, that a painting, you regarded this painting as ugly and worthless? And I say, and I talk it through with you. We stand there and I say, well, what you don't realize is this is his approach. This is what he's saying. This is the significance of the painting, whether that's in bulk or otherwise. And now you see it as beautiful or meaningful or valuable, and you didn't before. Okay, so I've convinced you of an ought. I've convinced you of a value or something. But there's nothing real here. None of it exists, right? And that's okay. I mean, the thing is, unless you're a disillusioned monotheist or you're like Plato or something, you have some really bizarre philosophy about, objective morality existing, and you're mourning the loss of this objective morality. There's nothing wrong in that picture. I'm not left, reaching into abstractions, trying to find some objectively real standard of beauty or what have you. But yes, I can convince others of my moral beliefs or my moral conclusions, or however you want to put it. They can share in that, but it's completely subjective, even when it's intersubjective, and that's okay.
Yeah. So when it comes to being subjective, do you delineate it into two different discrete types of subjectivity? Like, say, for instance, relativism versus epistemological objectivity. Do you even do that, or do you just treat it all as relative necessarily?
Yeah, I guess the truth is I don't, because I'm not ever in a circumstance where you need to divide it into one or the other. But I think it is true that we do in 2018 we talk about cognitive nihilism, which is more this epistemological thing, as opposed to moral nihilism or cosmological nihilism, or what I talk about, historical nihilism. But yeah, otherwise, no, I haven't really had a reason to separate into categories that way. In real world applications, the epistemological side of it rarely comes up overtly or explicitly, but it really does inform things silently and implicitly. Even that example of me talking to my boss, the fact that I didn't respond to that by saying to him, "You're a bad person because you believe in sex with underage girls," and like, it's not coming back in that way. The fact that I responded the way that I did, that's what reflects the epistemology. But it's not like I'm responding to him by asking an epistemological question. Well, how do we know the significance of the number 18? This is not where I'm going to go with it.
Yeah. So what would you say are your because this could have tie-ins to your moral, not moral, your political ideologies, your political theories? Like, what exactly do you follow? The left wing? Do you follow the right wing? Do you follow the centrist, authoritarian, libertarian, etc.? What exactly would you call yourself? Would you basically tie yourself into, politically speaking?
Right. So you can probably guess this is very parallel to a lot of the answers I've given before.
Yeah.
It would depend on which culture I was living in and where I was and so on. And I don't mean that in a shallow way or as an evasion. So in a recent video, I pointed out, well, some people consider me conservative and some people consider me left wing. If I lived in Texas, I think I'd be considered left wing. I did some research on the politics of Greece. And it seemed to me that in Greece at that time, I would have been at about the center of the political spectrum. I would have been a kind of mainstream Democrat, on most of the issues that were there. When I lived in Taiwan, there is no left versus right dichotomy. They have an independentist versus reunificationist political spectrum, and where I stand in Taiwanese politics is different. So the history. So I mentioned this in a recent video. People used to call me an originist within Buddhism. I like to refer things to their origins.
Yeah.
The difference between left and right goes back to the French Revolution, the creation of the Revolutionary Parliament. And there were other very specific political terms that actually refer to the layout of that room. There was actually a bump in the floor that was jokingly referred to as the mountain. And people who happened to sit next to the mountain, it was referred to as a mountainist tendency. It's just because the floorboards were warped in that part of the room. But the people who actually sat on the left side of the room as opposed to the right side of the room, that was where that idea first came from, the seating arrangements in the French Revolutionary Parliament, which were watched and influenced conceptions throughout Europe. Right now in the United States of America, is it left wing or right wing to be anti-corruption, to want reforms that get corruption in the government?
Mm.
The answer is it's neither one.
Yeah.
Right? Is it left wing or right wing? To want to make cutting the foreskin off an infant illegal. So this is called circumcision. Cutting off part of an infant's penis illegal. It's neither one. Now, there are other examples that are counterexamples. In a sense, it shouldn't be left wing to care about First Nations languages, Indigenous peoples' languages, Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, Inuit, or what have you. But again, I'm a nihilist. I'm going to tell it like it is. In reality, where I live in Canada, it seems like only left-wing people care about that issue.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it'll change, but it's a very small minority. It's a very weak issue with the left. And you can also see there's no connection. There's no meaningful sense in which it is, a left-wing issue. So again, now some people would respond as we're saying, well, Eisel, this is really about self-knowledge. Like I know what I care about. I know what my desires are and what objectives I want. And indeed, even like I asked my boss, I know what kind of society I want to live in. So I know about all these isolated issues. Well, okay, another one is veganism. Is veganism a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue? In a sense, it's neither, or it should be neither. There's nothing left-wing about veganism. There's nothing left-wing about ecology. But it's quite likely, if you're watching this in Texas, probably in Texas, only left-wing people care about ecology.
Wait. What do you think about people who say that veganism is necessarily intersectional?
Okay, great question. But do you want to finish this question?
Sure. Yeah,
right. Sorry, because so this question was, so I'll write down intersectional. Okay, but this question was, am I left wing or am I right wing, or where do I stand on these things? So I think an outsider can look at this and say, okay, so I have self-knowledge. I know about the particular objectives I want or what have you. And then I can look at the left and right and figure out, what I want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, in as much as that's true, that's what everyone should do. And you should, and it may take years, whatever. You're relatively young, you may figure out. I mean, like most people have never even thought about prison reform. Okay. Once you think about it, holy shit, this is a huge issue. Education reform, you're already onto. Is education reform a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue? Is prison reform? It's these issues, once you know them and you understand them, you're not going to feel at home probably anywhere on the political spectrum. Maybe you're lucky and you live in a country where these issues are debated and are mainstream part of politics. But I think this is also part of the reality of true democracy, is that true democracy would be able to capture, express and debate these issues. And fake democracy can't. Fake democracy is just not capable of things. Anyway, I don't think it's about self-knowledge. Someone else might see it that way, and there's some truth to that. Again, what I really credit for this is nihilism, is that I don't think in ideological terms about these things. Even if in the end I'm going to take the pieces together and maybe I'm going to cynically write a speech that tries to convince left-wing people to care about prison reform. What I'm doing, I'm not thinking ideologically. I'm not starting from an ideal or concluding with an ideal, or matters of belief. And thus I see the world in this different way. And over time, it takes time, issue by issue, I build up a sophisticated kind of portfolio of political of political opportunities to make the world a better place that I'm looking out for. And if I could make the world a better place by being a member of the Conservative Party, I'd do it. Right now, it doesn't seem to be the case. If I could make the world a better place by being a member of a left-wing party, I'd probably do it too.
Yeah.
With some caveats in both cases. How much you're gonna have to tolerate this stuff. So the intersectional issue. Look, intersectionalism is really a chalkboard philosophy. It exists at academic conferences and not much else. So I think the first misconception some vegans have the misconception that intersectionalism is a big movement that veganism can co-opt, and like veganism can latch onto it and make itself more important. And I really feel the opposite is true. I think intersectionalism is a very narrow academic discipline, and veganism is going to make itself narrower and smaller and weaker by trying to latch onto that and get involved. So that's a pragmatic argument. The counter argument is the central notion of intersectionalism, the concept of overlapping oppressions. Could this be useful for veganism? Maybe, sometimes, just barely.
And how
so? Look, in Sri Lanka, the butchers are almost all Muslim. Mm-hmm. Why? Because Buddhists believe killing animals causes bad karma. In general, the Hindus don't want that kind of job. There's probably a very small number of Buddhists and Hindus who slaughter animals. Okay, so you have an ethnic and religious difference. It is ethnic too. The Muslims are ethnically different from the Sinhalese Buddhists or the Tamil Hindus or what have you. So you have an ethnic difference related to production of meat. Does that make intersectionalism kind of useful or meaningful here in preaching veganism in this context? I honestly don't see the utility. I don't see how that's useful. But it's totally a situation where there are overlapping questions of race, ethnicity, oppression, religion, and veganism and animal slaughter. Sure. The actual publications I've seen that have come out of vegan intersectionalism are garbage, so I'm not optimistic about it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, look, hey, I'm a nihilist. I'm profoundly open-minded. If someone was really going to do something productive with that, look, and the other thing is, you wouldn't call it intersectionalism, but taking advantage of opportunities like the positive connection between veganism and Buddhism. Can you do something positive with that? Maybe, yeah. So can you take advantage of a positive connection between veganism and African American culture and hip hop? Maybe, but that kind of thing we normally don't describe as intersectionalism, because intersectionalism is really just this academic discipline.
Yeah, I do.
You can tell I'm keeping it all the way real. This would be a more entertaining video if I gave you a kind of anti-SJW rant, but that's not what I do.
Yeah, that's perfectly fair. Like, I respect the honesty. That's just perfect. So, like, do you think that it's important to preserve things from what's the word? Like when things go into extinction. There we go. You have that whole preference for things to not go into extinction, and if you do, is it moral or is it aesthetic?
So I assume you're talking within the human realm here. You're not talking about species. You're talking about animals going extinct. You're talking about elements of human culture and language.
Culture, extinction, and species, just in general.
Okay, I think to me they're two very different things. So look, I have no problem with the tradition of circumcision going extinct. I think the world would be an absolutely better place. If that was something we looked back on as part of our historical past that we'd evolved out of. The reality is, when you look at something like, I think the main example people question me about is, why should the Cree language exist in the future, or the Ojibwe language? So for those who don't know, these are languages indigenous to Canada. Well, again, it's a bit like the morality of building a bridge. If you want to build this bridge, you got to spend a certain amount of money and commit a certain amount of resources, and it's got to be a certain span, a certain height. There are minimum requirements.
Yeah.
Now, if you want Canada to be a democracy that is not built on genocide, the meaning of genocide in this context, we all understand. We know what that would mean. Not genocide, the opposite of genocide. What that would really mean is a wide open question in Canada. What would be a Canada that's not built on genocide? And, the number of elected members of parliament we've had who are First Nations is incredibly tiny. The role of these languages in our society is so marginal. It's way more marginal than Chinese. The Chinese language is everywhere, and so on. So, these are questions that come up in this sense. Now, is there an absolute value intrinsic to the language or intrinsic to the tradition? I don't believe in any absolute values. I don't believe anything is intrinsic, to anything. But, in Europe, should the French people just stop speaking French? They could all just speak English, or they could all just speak German, and maybe there'd be an economic advantage. That nobody is discussing this possibility. There's no debate about the French language going extinct, within Europe. But I think if we were going to really rigorously, philosophically or politically, discuss that matter, then we'd get into, in what sense is the existence of the French language, a good thing or a bad thing, or required by this or that vision of society. Sure. But no, obviously, it's impossible to believe in tradition for the sake of tradition. It's impossible to believe in preservation for the sake of preservation. Because that would look at this point, especially when we're talking about these really marginalized cultures. Nobody is suggesting that the Cree and Ojibwe should be allowed to fight wars and take people slaves and have a farm economy based on slaves who are taken captive in war. That was part of their traditional culture. There's no discussion of reviving that. The question is now, when their culture and religion and languages have been so devastated, the question is what can survive. There's no question about whether or not they're going to use soap. There's no debate. They want to use soap. They want to use toothpaste. They want to use the internet and bank machines. All those debates are dead. So the question is, what can we salvage? And for me, so I grew up Jewish to some extent. I grew up communist to a much greater extent. My parents were communists. It was a much more important part of my upbringing.
Yeah.
Is there any fragment of Judaism that I preserve in my life? Is there any fragment of communism that I preserve in my life? Probably not. Probably it's actually at zero. So I think generally I just point out, generally in questioning tradition, most of those discussions are over at that end of the spectrum, where is there any little scrap of tradition you're gonna keep it all? And the exceptions would be looking at like Afghanistan today. Can we convince the people of Afghanistan that it's better to have daughters that are literate rather than illiterate?
Yeah.
Can we really destroy this cultural tradition? Because that's what we're talking about for the future of Afghanistan. It's an absolutely hostile relationship. So and then it's a very different kind of discourse. Yeah.
Yeah.
But as you say, in my answer, I think nothing that I just said can be applied to habitat conservation for wild animals.
Yeah.
I just say so. I mean, you provocatively suggested that the same answer might serve for both, but I think that's actually a totally different question. So yeah.
Which is fair. And I do want to keep things on politics, so we'll probably avoid the question of animal extinction. Sure. Yeah, so it's redundant. Anyway, so now with regards to politics and vegan activism in the modern marketplace of ideas, how exactly do you think we should be doing it? And well, first of all, how do you think it's going right now?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the state of vegan activism. It's better than it's ever been in the past, and yet it's pretty terrible. It's pretty pathetic at this stage. So things are better than they've ever been in the past. And when I talk to people who are overly cynical or overly pessimistic about it, I point that out, how much better the situation is now than it ever was previously. The main comparisons I use are to successful movements for social, cultural, and legal change, like gay rights. I also like to use examples of moves to ban cigarette smoking, to change the culture of smoking cigarettes, but also to change laws. There have been legal changes. You're not allowed to smoke in various places, and even to change seatbelt regulation. These things all have in common that they're movements that were based on small minorities of people. Totally nonviolent. There was no civil war. So some vegans, including Wayne Seong and Direct Action Everywhere, including to some extent Gary Francione and the abolitionists, even the word abolitionist, that's based on a comparison to the abolition of slavery in the history of the United States of America. And it's specifically slavery in the United States of America, not Sri Lanka, not Thailand. A lot of countries abolished slavery, not just America, but it's based on that one narrative. Well, the abolition of slavery in the United States of America involved a civil war that killed a very significant percentage of the population.
Yeah.
And it's also worthwhile to note it was a civil war predominantly fought by white people against other white people. There were black combatants. I'm not saying there were zero, but I'm just saying when you look at the economics of the war, of who paid for it, and the number of people who laid down their lives, it's very significant to note these were mostly white people fighting over this issue. That's the horrible reality of the Civil War. So I just say that is not the same as, for instance, in Haiti, in the Caribbean. Slavery was ended in Haiti by black people rising up and killing the white people. That was a slave rebellion, not a white-on-white slave owners' civil war. This model has absolutely zero applicability to the current or future situation of veganism. And instead, by contrast, the type of lobbying, the type of struggle for social and political change that gay rights just went through within my lifetime, it's a wonderful, positive example. How many people were really involved in the gay rights movement? Was it even 1%? Was it 2%? I mean, involved or activists at all? A very, very, very small percentage of people were directly involved in the gay rights movement. How many people even cared? Like, most of the public was indifferent. And of course, some people were actively homophobic. And they had a very, very tough, argument to make in convincing the majority to entertain the legal changes they wanted and what have you. I remember being told in school when I was in junior high, one of the professors in junior high teachers in junior high gave his official denunciation of homosexuals and his explanation for why homosexuals should not be allowed to be school teachers. And his argument basically was built on the assumption that all homosexuals are pedophiles. Well,
yeah.
Arguing against that in the 1980s was very tough, trying to convince governments and people that no, it was perfectly safe for a gay man to be a school teacher, that being a gay man or a married gay man or something, who has sex with other adult men is not the same as being a pederast or a pedophile or being a threat to the student body. That's really not. It's not in the 1980s or 1970s or 1960s. It was not an easy argument to make. That actually it should be a civil right to be openly gay while being a school teacher. So that's tough. Now, I'm only mentioning how tough that is because I think a lot of vegans think it's really tough to convince people to stop drinking cow milk and start drinking soy milk. I guess it's tough. I don't think quitting cow milk is nearly as tough as quitting cigarette smoking.
Oh, absolutely.
Cigarette smoking stuff. I don't think quitting cow milk is nearly as tough as quitting homophobia. And that may sound like an ugly comparison, but we culturally, homophobia was part of an image of strength and virility, what it meant to be a man. And in this example, I used also taking care of your children and defending your children against corruption and evil. There's a sense of morality and all this stuff packaged up in sexual identity and homophobia. These are huge, difficult cultural transitions. And a small minority of people who were well organized and cared about them passionately brought about those forms of cultural change without a civil war and through, I think, basically democratic and transparent means. Maybe there's some some footnote there, but you know, it wasn't through violent revolution or what have you. So that for me is the road forward for veganism. And you know, can you accomplish a vegan world? There's going to be a whole series of small victories that draw attention to the basic concepts and underlying principles of veganism before you get any big victories. But sure, I'll give you a small victory. We could have a 20% tax on leather shoes, and you can have a negative tax, 20% off any shoes that are completely non-leather, that are completely vegan. And partly this is because leather is now obsolete. And even just in debating that, you'd be making people aware, hey, you may see leather boots as something invisible, as a status symbol that's part of daily life. But if you can engage the public in a debate about that law and realize, wow, leather is unnecessary, it's obsolete, it's hard to take care of, it's expensive, it releases toxins into the air, which most people don't know, chromium hexane. It's bad for the workers who create it. And there's this, you know, unbelievable, you know, animal holocaust thing going on in the background too. You might be interested in, you know, they're ecological as well as ethical arguments. The lead up, I mean, in the same way, the most important thing about gay marriage probably was the debate before the law was passed, was engaging the public in a debate about homosexuality in future society. Probably the debate you'd have leading up to passing a law like that would be more significant. And that is how veganism will make progress.
Awesome.
That's my claim.
Beautiful. Well, I think that was absolutely fantastically said. And I think it's time to wrap things up because we're passing the 2.5 hour mark. So thank you so much for coming on. That's been absolutely fantastic.
Great talking, Darren. Totally different conversation from the one I was expecting to have, but I hope it's good for you. I hope it's good for your viewers. And, you know, the other thing I'd say is one of the reasons I'm talking to Darren, ultimately, I'm out here to recruit talent. The kind of social and political change I'm talking about, you know, it's going to involve small groups of people who have high levels of trust and cooperation. And I don't know what the future holds for you, but I'm not planning to disappear, whether it's 5 years or 10 years from now. I'm out here on the internet. I'm not making money out of YouTube, but what I'm hoping to do is find colleagues, find talent, and in the future, you know, we can save the planet. It's ultimately what it comes down to.
Fantastic way to end the discussion. But do you think you'd be good to have another stream sometime in the future? Because
sure, of course.
With a bunch of postgraduates. So I'm hoping to have a guy named Ozzy Mendias around in a second. I've referred to him in the very early parts of this stream. He has a master's. He was a philosopher, but he's retired now.
You don't need to put deals. I'm open-minded. Sure, I'm open to that kind of thing. And it's just going to rely on my travel schedule, my work schedule, because I'm going to France in a couple of weeks now. But otherwise, sure, Darren, I'm happy to.
Subject, by the way, will be objective morality. It should be perhaps next weekish, maybe the week after that. I want to make sure that everyone's given sufficient notice. And on top of that, just to end the stream as well, I would like to say special thanks to my patrons, Janet Speed, and I think there's another one. Thank you so much, guys. You guys have been absolutely amazing. Shout out to Giant Lolly. You're amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. I hope this has been educational. I hope it's perhaps advanced your thought at least a little bit. And perhaps you will have a different approach to activism in the future. Perhaps you have a different approach to politics in the future. Perhaps you have a different approach to philosophy in the future. Perhaps you'll be more interested in philosophy. So I hope you've learned a little bit here and there from what we've discussed. And I'd like to say, just, you guys are amazing. Peace out.